Hi, I'm John DeDakis, and you're one to one with me. And I'm one to one with Barry Fulton. Barry is an interesting guy. I've known him for a couple of years now. He is he writes the Thomas Sebastian Scott Espionage mystery series. He's a retired diplomat, an Air Force officer, and university professor, and he's been posted to NATO headquarters, Italy, Japan, Pakistan, and Turkey. He lives in Chevy Chase, Maryland, with his wife, Marianne, and he spends his weekends in a cabin in West Virginia. So, Barry Fulton, it's great to be able to talk to you. Unfortunately, it's not in person, but this is the next best thing. So, thanks for being here. How have you been?
I've been great, and this is a great opportunity to see you again. It's been, 6 months or so before the virus that we had lunch together, and looking forward to that again when we finally can get out and mix up.
So you've been busy. You've been writing, and you've got a new book out. Let me see. This is a very low budget operation here, Barry. I am the producer. I'm the talent. I'm the guest booker. I am the technical director. I'm the operator, and I handle the graphics as well. So I'm going to try to do this now where I can share the screen to show people the cover of your new book, and we will talk about it briefly. So there it is. And let me make sure that I can make it full screen here. There. The Irish Imbroglio by Barry Fulton. Tell us about this, Barry. What's the book about?
Well, that cover looks good, and so I can brag about the cover since I didn't design it. The story is the NSA, National Security Administration, finds that through their intelligence sources that there is an attack planned on America's nuclear power plants. The attack might be coming from Russia, maybe North Korea. They can't tell for sure, but something is in the works. And they call back into service a retired NSA cybersecurity specialist, the protagonist of my book. And he works with a young analyst, half his age, to try to uncover who is threatening the power plants in the United States. And during that course of the book, he encounters, I'll put it this way, a lot of interesting people. Some who live in West Virginia, where his home is located, many overseas in Austria, Northern Ireland, and Rome.
So you write it's always authors have to write what they know. So you've not been ever posted in Ireland, I don't believe. So how did you figure that one out?
I visited Ireland a number of times, and in preparation for this book, my wife and I went there for a couple of weeks, and I walked the streets and took notes and took pictures so I could describe the locale. But of course, I have spent a lot of time in Rome, and I've spent a lot of time also in Vienna and Salzburg, where part of this is also set.
And tell me when it was that you actually started to think about writing fiction. How did that come about?
Well, I've heard from some friends who said to me, this must have been a lifetime dream of yours. Actually, it wasn't. I've been writing ever since I graduated from college. I wrote in the Foreign Service, as you would guess, and I've taught as an adjunct professor at several universities, and so I've done academic writing. And after I retired from the Foreign Service, I went back as a contractor and worked for the State Department and did a good bit of writing there. And then it was 10 years or so ago, it occurred to me it'd be a lot of fun to write fiction. I, I knew how to write. I will confess I didn't know how to write fiction, but I knew how to write. And I thought it'd be fun to make things up uh, and describe places that I have served in or knew well, and then otherwise invent the characters.
And when you write, when you make things up, is that difficult compared to the kind of arduous adherence to facts that you had uh, that you had to do as a diplomat? You know, was it hard to make it up?
No, that's the easy part. I love it.
Now, and of course, you know, as a journalist, we go through the same kind of thing. I mean, unlike what some presidents tell you, it's a firing offense, you know, for journalists at reputable news organizations to make things up. And I would imagine it's the same, you know, in the Foreign Service. And of course, we've just gone through the not only the impeachment process, but the trial in the Senate, and in which Trump was acquitted. I'm sure you watched that with quite close attention.
Yes.
I'd be interested, now that you're out of the Foreign Service, tell us what your take is on what went on. You know, should he have been acquitted? How do you account for, you know, how everything turned out?
Well, of course, he should not have been acquitted but it was a political decision. It was not a judicial decision. Uh, there were several people who testified during the House hearings. The former ambassador to the Ukraine, who was pulled out of Ukraine on short notice, basically because Judy Giuliani had other fish to fry in Ukraine at the time, and then she was replaced by several months later on a temporary status by an old friend of mine, Bill Taylor, who years before had been the ambassador to Ukraine. And Bill and I served together in NATO for 4 years. As you would guess, I know him very, very well and know his family. And Bill is a guy who is a model, former Army officer, West Point graduate, and he has, as far as I know, no political agenda. I did not see that when I was at NATO. He served there for a Republican-appointed ambassador as his special assistant. And Bill told the story exactly the way it happened. And I think we should all be alarmed that the man who tried to trade Ukrainian assistance for his election was found not guilty by the Senate.
And you say it was obviously a political decision in the Senate. Why do you think the Republicans went along with it and didn't see it the way you saw it?
Well, I'm not suggesting anything that the whole world doesn't know. The Senate members, with the exception of Mitt Romney, understand that their future, based on what's happened in the last couple of years, depends pretty much on Trump's approval. And Romney has a political base that is not dependent on Trump, but others who thought to oppose him earlier on are no longer in office. And so, as far as I'm concerned, it was a total sellout because there was no ambiguity about what happened.
So where do we go from here? Do you have a sense? I mean, do you have a sense that everything hangs in the balance in November, or do you feel that the way Trump has been handling the coronavirus, the response to the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis, do you see that as his undoing, or are things, in your opinion, looking as if they could go and he'll get 4 more years?
Well, Trump's choice as National Security Director, John Bolton, of course, after he resigned, Trump claims he was fired, but as I understand it, he resigned, uh, wrote the book that now is at the top of the bestseller list that confirms everything that career people said about his relationship with Ukraine, but not only Ukraine, also with the North Koreans, the Chinese, the Russians. It's all confirmed. And I think anyone who had any doubts by now must have had those doubts squashed. November, I follow the polls. You do. All of your listeners probably follow the polls. And if the election were held today, Trump would be defeated. It will come down, as the pollsters know, to 4 or 5 states. And it's going to be Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, my old stomping grounds. I'm a Pennsylvanian. Maybe Florida and North Carolina. And even in those states, the polls are now showing that Trump will lose the Electoral College vote. The Economist magazine says there's a 99% chance that Biden wins the popular vote and a 90% chance he wins the electoral vote. My worry at the moment is what happens after the AP and others who do the count and before the Electoral College meets. What happens when we hear once again from the Oval Office that this is all fraudulent? And I told you so because those mail ballots must have been sent by the Chinese or somebody else. That worries me, seriously worries me.
What is it specifically that does worry you if the legitimacy of the vote is questioned?
Well, there is precedent. 1876, the candidate who then had what appeared to be the majority of votes in the Electoral College, it was challenged, and the decision finally at that time went to the Senate. That's not the route that I think it would go now, but at that time it went to a Senate panel, and the Senate panel at that time found that the votes in 3 states were improper, and they gave the presidency to Tyler. So there is some precedent for chicanery at the highest levels. I have enough confidence in our political system that I think at the end of the day, if Biden gets the majority of the Electoral College votes, that he will become the president. I worry about the damage that is done to our democracy between November 3rd and January 20th, when we hear claims of deceit, fraud, and all of that.
One of the things that troubles me is that, and I'm sure you as well, is that over the last almost 4 years, there has been a steady drumbeat of criticism directed against the State Department, the NSA, journalism, the court system, the WHO, all of these institutions that are in place and that have a long history. There's now the whole deep state conspiracy type things. You and I have probably had experiences of people in our lives who we respect a lot for their intelligence and their experience, operating as if we're living in 2 separate almost parallel universes with separate sets of facts. Have things become so toxic that there's just a total erosion of trust in some of the basic systems of government?
Well, John, you're a journalist, and you could tell your viewers better than I can the standards that journalists use, which I completely respect. And I've worked with. I was in public affairs when I was in diplomatic service, and during that time, I worked with journalists all the time. I spent 4 years at NATO. I worked close up with 20 or so resident journalists in Brussels who covered NATO. And during NATO summits, we would have a couple hundred journalists present. And I briefed, and from where I was sitting, I was the briefer. And then from where they were sitting, and where you might have been sitting if you had been there at the time, you were eager to learn what our plan was, what we, the United States, was planning to do in terms of the forthcoming summit, or whatever issue it was in dealing with arms control issues in particular. And during that time, in the 4 years I was there, I never had a journalist intentionally misrepresent the briefings that I or others on the NATO staff gave. There was one occasion when a journalist from a German paper got it wrong, and the next day made a correction. He had misunderstood something. But I never had anyone in 4 years misrepresent anything about our position.
So where does all this stuff about the deep state come from?
You know, I worked for two different ambassadors when I was at NATO, and of course, going back to my previous assignments, a total of 5, 6, 7 ambassadors, I guess. And I'm a Democrat, but I'm confident that no ambassador that I worked for ever knew my politics. It was my role to represent the administration. And whatever the administration policy was, I had to represent it. And if I could not represent it, as all of us in the State Department knew, our only option then was to resign. But
and so, just to be clear, in some cases, you were also representing Republican administrations?
Oh, absolutely. And as I did in NATO. I mean, I was, William Howard Taft III had been the Deputy Secretary of Defense under Cap Weinberger. And 2 years into my NATO assignment, he left that position and was named ambassador to NATO. With a name like William Howard Taft III, you would guess he was a Republican, sure enough. I was his primary speechwriter, and I wrote practically all of his speeches for 2 years. And I obviously he was pleased with that, or it would have stopped after the first couple of weeks. And I worked also for Democratic named ambassadors, and I wrote. I wasn't a speechwriter for them. I worked for them and did reporting for them, but Taft and his predecessor, NATO, were the only two where I was a full-time speechwriter.
So, but where does this deep state idea come from?
You know, it's the fantasy that we hear about journalists, about the World Health Organization, about the intelligence community. You know, we in the State Department, insofar as my 30 years experience will confirm for you, had the same role as a lawyer would have representing a client. The lawyer may or may not agree with the client, may or may not think the client is innocent, may or may not like him. But if that lawyer doesn't do his best to represent that client, then he's not a professional. And I understood that the day I joined the Foreign Service. And in my first week after I had joined, after I had taken the exams and joined, first week in orientation, what would you do if you disagreed with the policy of the administration? And I said, that's irrelevant. I would do my best to represent it. And what if you could no longer represent it? I said, well, then I know the rules. I would resign. That's as simple as that. And John, what's happening now is a tragedy, because for years and years, the Foreign Service members are admitted to the Foreign Service through an examination process. That's a two-step process. First of all, you take a written exam, and it's like an SAT exam. And that's sort of the first way to limit the numbers. And after that, those people who are in the top, whatever percentage that they believe are still competitive for joining the Foreign Service, then there's a 6 to 8 hour oral examination process. And from that, numbers are assigned by examiners, and there's a rank order list created. And so somebody's number one on that list, and somebody's, number 325. And members, those who have taken the exam, are then invited to join the Foreign Service from the top down. If they need 30 people in this class, the first 30 get invited. And by that time, my experience is that a lot of other people are after those exam takers as well, and some of them have already accepted a job. I was once a director of Foreign Service personnel for USIA, and I remember a time when we offered a very promising candidate a job, and at that time, this goes back many years, at that time we were offering him a position of something like $31,000. And he said, I'd love to come, but I had an offer from IBM of $60,000. Can you match that? And we have rule. The rule. We can offer you 31 really good dollars, but we can't go beyond that. So typically, over the past several years, and this goes back years, there have been about 20,000 people who've applied to take the written exam. In the last year, there were 7,000 or 8,000 people applied to take the exam, and this is we don't know which 7,000 or 8,000 people they are. Maybe they're the 7,000 or 8,000 people that wouldn't have passed before. Maybe the 7,000 or 8,000 people that would have passed have found greener pastures. It's a shame.
If Biden is elected, has the damage that's been done to the integrity of journalism, diplomacy, foreign service, is it irreparable? Is the damage irreparable? And if not, what can be done to restore trust?
I think the Foreign Service and intelligence community will both have their trust restored when people who are competent are named to the positions, and when the practice of those diplomats and those intelligence analysts is shown to be professional from top to bottom. I don't think it'll happen overnight, but I think it'll happen. But what about journalism? I think the journalists have a tougher row.
You're definitely right, and that is something that is being discussed a lot in newsrooms, and it should be discussed because in many ways journalism needs to be held account, just as journalists hold public officials to account. And so if the issue is accuracy, then journalists, I think, are under pressure now more than ever to get it right. And so I think we're starting to see that. But journalism is made up of flawed individuals. So it's and I've been behind the scenes. I know how messy it can get and how imperfect it is. So it's I think in the same sense for institutions, it's also the same for journalism. Restoring trust and maintaining trust will be a work in progress, and it's a battle that has to be fought on a daily basis.
Well, the same is true in the Foreign Service. Diplomats too make mistakes, and all diplomats aren't equal, of course. And mistakes have been made by the intelligence community. We know. I am simply not aware in my 30 years of anybody in the diplomatic service making a malicious, creating some malicious or false reporting. I'm aware of some mistakes, but that's going to keep happening.
And what about our standing in the rest of the world? Trump has flirted with the idea of getting out of NATO. He has put the WHO on notice that we're bailing out of that. Climate control or climate, the whole climate change issue, the U.S. is not taking a lead on anymore. How does the rest, you're still in touch, I'm sure, with, many people around the world. How does the rest of the world view the United States right now, in your opinion, and based on your experience?
Well, I would confess that I'm not really in personal touch with many people around the world. I follow the press reports very closely, and I am in touch with people who are still in the State Department. And morale is rock bottom in the State Department because of what people are not allowed to do, or what they're expected to do, or what they're criticized for doing when they do something right. I mean, I'm just as, it wasn't an hour before we began that I read that the CDC's advice that they gave yesterday at the request of the vice president is going to be changed. That's a crime. That's a crime. And people like Colonel Vittich, who now just resigned his commission because he was being bullied, and like my friend Bill Taylor, who stood up exactly for what was right, I think that you will find in the new administration that that integrity that we have seen examples of will be broadly apparent, and that's going to, over time, cause the change. But what happens? What happens? This is a question for you. Am I allowed to ask you a question?
Yeah, but I don't have to answer.
What happens when Trump actually leaves office? Let's say he loses decisively, and finally on the 20th of January, somehow he sneaks out the back door or is ushered out the front door. Then what are we going to have? Are we going to have Trump TV?
Oh boy. Well, I don't think so. I don't think so, because quite frankly, I think that the Southern District of New York is going to slap the handcuffs on him. I bet that there are criminal investigations that have been ongoing and will then, now that once he's no longer president, is fair game for prosecution for any number of things. I think that's I think that's a distinct possibility. And I think it's also, and something that they're gaming, from what I hear, that there's an entire possibility that he will, resist leaving office. I mean, he's audacious. He's broken the, he's broken the mold in terms of behavior. So who knows what can happen?
Yeah, but Max Boot was part of the gaming where what happens when he refuses to leave office.
Yeah,
and that could happen. But I like your vision. I want to see him in handcuffs with his hands above his head, waving goodbye to Mitch McConnell.
Well, so let's switch gears to writing, because look, we both write what we know. I give people a glimpse behind the scenes in journalism, and I try to make it a fair representation because, as I've said, it's messy, and you write espionage thrillers, and even though you were never in the NSA, apparently you write with some authority about that. So do your novels, do you feel, accurately depict what it's like behind the scenes? If people read your books, will they come away with a better understanding and appreciation for the NSA and diplomacy and things like that?
Well, up to a point. There was, at the time I served in Rome, one of the networks decided to do a TV series based on the work of diplomats. And they brought in a writer, and they brought in a crew, and they actually did a pilot program. I remember the ambassador's wife went out of her way to try to be part of the pilot, but that didn't quite work out. At any rate, they did a pilot, and after having done the pilot, they scrapped the whole deal because most of the work of diplomatic service is pretty boring. It doesn't show well on TV. I mean, they, to make it interesting, they had the economic counselor having an affair with somebody. They did it. Likewise, what I know about the intelligence community is what I've learned from friends who've been in the community, and what I've read about, and I do a good bit of reading, and likewise, if one didn't take a few liberties, basically with the speed at which things happen, the novels would be very boring. And so I've taken some liberties, but I've tried to be faithful to what it is that people do. And my characters in the all four books, including the current one, Thomas Sebastian Scott's the protagonist in all of them. And in the latest one, he's aging, of course, because the first one was written 8 years ago. And he's a little bit worried about whether he shouldn't be hanging it up and stop going back as a consultant. And his colleague that he mentored when he first joined, who's half his age, she's about 35, she's a deaf analyst, and she is based on a person I know in the intelligence community who is a deaf analyst. And they set out to try to solve the question of who is causing, who is behind what appears to be a forthcoming attack on a couple of nuclear power plants, and they aren't sure how many. And if they can figure out who it is, how can it be stopped? And I have my characters occasionally getting off the reservation, and I make that clear in the book, that they're doing things that the NSA is not set up to do. And I have my main character once told by the CIA station chief that he's stepped out of his lane, and so back off. You guys don't do that. So I've taken that liberty, but what it is they do, I've tried to represent accurately.
What advice do you have for someone who is contemplating writing fiction? How hard is it to do? What are some of the mistakes you made and learned from that you would like to have been tipped off about so that you wouldn't have made those mistakes?
Oh, well, people do ask me that occasionally, and usually friends who are surprised that I've written, and how did you start, and how do you go about it, and so on. And my fast answer to that is, if you're inspired to write, the only way to get started is to sit down in front of a computer and keyboard, or if you are old-fashioned and want to write with a pen, I doubt that happens very much anymore, but sit down in front of a keyboard and start writing and draw on what you know in terms of locale, in terms of story, and then develop your characters. And, some of them will probably come out of people like the young analyst in the current book. In the first book, there are a lot of characters in the first book, too many. One of the things I learned is there's a limit to the number of characters you should put in a book. There are two of those characters based on people I've known, and I took a lot of liberties with them. The one character, and he is in all the books, and I've come to like him a lot. His name is Spencer Cobb, and he's based on a lawyer that I've known for many years, actually a person I worked for, very active politically, a Republican, a person who said when I finally retired, Fulton, tell me, what are your politics exactly? And I said, I'm proud that you don't know. So when I based his character on him, I called him and I said, this book's coming out sometime, and I based a character on you, and it's not particularly the sort of description you might like, and I know you can be litigious, so before I publish it, would you read the sections, because you might recognize yourself. So it was about 3 weeks later when I got a call one Sunday morning, and he said, Fulton, do you have pencil and paper? He said, well, I have a few notes for you. And he said, first of all, he said, you represent this character who does sound like me in many ways, as having never lost a case and being an old drunk. And he said, I would confess to at least one of those being true. So I have no objection to that. And he said, however, he said, he's West Virginia born, as I was. I knew he was West Virginia born. That's why. And he said, you have him talking too fancy for West Virginia. He knows the fancy talk all right, but when he's talking to other West Virginians, so you gotta back off on that. And I'll give you some language. And here on page such and such, where you have somebody's addressed him as counselor. They've never addressed me as counselor. They don't even know that word. They might say lawyer, or maybe they call me by my first name. I don't know. But at any rate, you just have to back off a little. And then he said, I think you're okay on this. So yes, I based a few people on characters a few of my characters on people I know. So that's what I did right. What did I do wrong? I didn't know enough about writing fiction when I started to write fiction. But I think the best way to learn is to do it and learn from your mistakes.
And tell me the role that writers groups have had in your development as an author.
Well, it was about a little more than a year ago. I was at a conference that, as I recall, you might have attended, the Malice Domestic.
Mm-hmm.
And I ran into everybody who's there is either a writer, or wants to be a writer, or a reader of mysteries. And so I found the way to introduce yourself is to say, what do you write? And so I had people all talk about their stuff. And I talked to one guy, and he asked me the same thing. And then time passed, and he actually, it was 2 years ago when I met him. And some time passed, and then about a year ago, I ran into him again, and he said, I'm reconstituting my writing group. Would you like to join? And I said, sure. And so I submitted the first chapter of the book that's just come out, The Irish Imbroglio. At that time, I called it The Irish Murders, but there weren't enough murders to use the plural. So I submitted the first chapter to the group, and when I met with them for the first time, I was the new guy, and 3 of the 4 people in the group were seriously published authors, short stories and novels. I mean, if you have one person who's written the Star Trek series, you know you're in serious territory, and one professional editor, and they, I thought they would say nice things about my first chapter, but they began by saying, first of all, we hope you have a thick skin, and secondly, this isn't the first chapter. This is the backstory. It's really boring. No one would read it. And then the other 3 all joined in, and I was sort of looking around the room thinking, how do I get out of here? But then he went on to say, this stuff's okay, your writing's okay, but it's not the first chapter. In a mystery, an espionage, if in the first chapter you don't have a body or a truck blown up, or no one's going to go any further. And this
something's got to happen. Something's got to happen.
And they said, you've been doing academic writing, haven't you? Where you do all the lead up to all the back stuff, or the diplomatic writing. I say, yeah, that's what I did. So, well, we have to train you to get this right. So I stayed with them, and I met with them every 2 weeks for a year, and we went over every chapter. And I can tell you that I learned a heck of a lot. I'm not one to brag and say it's a great book. I can tell you it's a better book than it would have been. I can tell you that.
One of the things that I think a lot of first-time writers are surprised about is the amount of time that they need to spend marketing their book. I mean, I don't know the exact statistic, but it's something like 50,000 books a day are published, which is nuts. It's just crazy, because how do you bubble to the top in a situation like that? And, there's traditional publishing, there's now self-publishing. How have you approached the whole idea of marketing, and what's been your experience in terms of self-publishing?
Well, I am not a good example of how to do it.
Okay.
Now, I'm imagining, John, that your viewership for this particular interview is going to run up to something like 10,000. I can't believe otherwise. And I imagine each of those people have have 10 friends. So I'm seeing 100,000 sales.
Good luck with that.
But, but, but on a but I don't sell many books, to tell you the truth. I publish through KDP.
What's that?
It's a Amazon subsidiary, and they offer the opportunity to publish either in Kindle format or paperback. I do both. You held up my book, and here I'm holding it up again. The paperback.
There it is.
There's a Kindle.
Oh, cool. All right.
Kindle version, and my website's pretty decent.
Let's put that up there. I'll put that up on the screen.
But I don't think I have many people look at it. My friends read the book and they pass it on to others, but I don't have many sales, to tell you the truth. And I remember one of my very close friends who was reading. There were only two people that read chapter by chapter as I went through my first book. My wife was one, and then a close friend of mine on who was at the time approaching 90 years of age, and just a brilliant guy. And as he read each chapter, he would say, "Barry, how's it going to end?" I would say, "I'm not sure." And he'd lean over and he'd say, "Well, you can tell me." Tell anybody. And I said, "Well, I don't know yet." And in fact, I did not know at that stage, and I've since learned that, novelists come in two categories: plotters who have it all outlined, and pantsers who go by the seat of their pants. And I'm the latter. I know the story. I know the protagonist, but things happen. They take a life of their own as I go through, and I sometimes surprise myself by what some people do, which is great fun. I enjoy that.
What I'm hearing is that for you, writing is its own reward, and that it's not really all about the money or all about the fame. It's just all about telling a good story. And if even only a handful of people come across it, that's okay. Am I reading that right?
Well, you're in the right ballpark, but I would love to have lots of readers.
Okay.
I'm not doing it for the money. I mean, I am retired, and so I don't need the money. I would love to have more readers, though, because I try, in addition to having something that is holds your attention and it gives you a laugh. One of my characters, all the readers say, is their favorite character, and he's a priest in a small mountain village, and he interacts with my protagonist because they were friends in seminary years and years ago, and he enjoys writing limericks, which I give him some assistance in writing. Since I brought it up, I'll read you one that's on the back of my book.
There once was a woman from Nantucket.
I have a Nantucket one, true, but it's not the one you're thinking of. I'll speak of an old sinner named Scott, he wrote, whose future was not what he sought. So I offered a prayer for the judge to be fair. The charges, I'm sure, are for naught. That came after Scott was arrested in Belfast for a murder. And readers of the book, I mentioned this hoping that there will be some readers. So yes, I would love to have more readers. And I think I'm also trying to say something serious within this book, but I may regret saying that because it is not a serious book in itself. But
well, I should also mention, though, that you do have a newsletter that you send out that it's quite informative, and I would imagine that if people go to your website, which is www.fultonpub.com, that they'll have a chance to sign up and receive your newsletter as well.
They will, and if they buy my book, they'll have a link in the book, and I could I even mention my email address?
Oh, sure. In fact, while you're doing that, I'll create if you want to go there and get all that spam, that's quite all right. Tell me what your email address is, and I'll put it up on the screen.
I get so much spam now, but I have a really good spam filter. My email address is rbfulton@gmail.com.
Okay, at gmail.com. I'm going to put it up
My newsletter.
on the screen.
Send me a note, and you'll get it. And it's sometimes
okay. Let's proofread it here together. rbfulton FULTON @gmail.com. So that's how people can get in touch with you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you're a brave soul.
Well, I mean, there's 10,000 people who watch your video cast. I'm waiting for them.
This has been a treat. It's great to see you again. Good luck with your writing. What's the next? Are you working on another one right now?
I've been doing short stories, and I have a short story that's been actually bought and will be published in a mystery magazine, Black Cat Mystery.
So you're going to get paid for this one?
Yeah, I am actually. Yeah.
You're as surprised as I am, right?
I have another short story out that will compete for Malice Domestic's next issue, and I'm working on a third one now, and so I'm finding satisfaction in the short story is that it doesn't take 2 years to finish it.
It's true. This has been fun. Barry Fulton, I've enjoyed talking with you. I hope we get a chance to do it again. Any final words?
John, let the world know what journalists really do, and I'll try to let the world know what diplomats really do. And we can have a celebration at noon on January the 20th.
Outstanding. Good to talk to you, Barry. Thank you.
John.